Hello and welcome back to another episode of On the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Rihanna. Thank you so much for all the response to last week's episode on stammoeders. It has been amazing to see how positive the response has been. Some negative, but comes with the job, I guess. But on TikTok, thank you for all the love that has come through and the learnings and just the absolute take on of what I put out there. And I really appreciate it. Welcome to all my new subscribers. I'm so happy that you are here and that you're enjoying the content. And I hope that I can keep it going. It's been really heartwarming recently that everybody's so interested in South Africa's history. Obviously, I'm not telling this from the standpoint of what has been told and what's out there in history books and what people have seen, drilling into very specific aspects of our history and as it pertains to colored people. What we have found, and what I found going through this process, is that it's not only about colored people, but most of South Africans and how it's bled into our country, our culture, everybody around us. So we're all learning together, which has been great. So let's talk about the slavery episode, which I promised from last week. This was supposed to be one episode. And you guys know what happens. It starts as one, and then it explodes, and Rihanna's head explodes, and then she's like, how do I make this a 20-minute episode? How do I make this work? And the best way I can do is to cut it up and do different aspects of it. So please stick with me, thinking there will only be 3 that we will need to get through together. So what is slavery? Sounds like a loaded question, right? So slavery is a form of domination of one person over another. Very much. Slaves have no personal freedom and they were the properties of other. Then I was on the Isiko Museum website and I read the following and I really wanted to share and get your thoughts. It says, people give different meanings to the word slavery. The term slave may be used in different contexts to indicate the lack of freedom or the lack of free will or hard work. Recent scholarships on the history of slavery has argued for the use of the term enslaved rather than slave, as it gives the enslaved individual an identity as people. Similarly, it has been argued that the term slaveholders should be used rather than slave owners or slave masters to indicate that the people were enslaved against their will. I really found that very interesting, how the change of a word gives identity to somebody. So let me know what you think. Before I go further, I just want to let you know there's going to be a lot of words that are going to make me vomit in my mouth. They're not great, but they are used. The form of slavery that came to the Cape Colony and America are known as chattel slavery. Chattel slaves were obtained in the lands of their birth and taken against their will to different places where they were sold again. Imagine being pulled from the only home that you know by people who don't speak your language, who don't know you, who don't even look like you, and sold as property. They were stolen, owned, sold, and transferred like a house. Those words just, okay. Especially because they're being used in relation to people. These people were chained and transported over long distances. Some of them were taken from their homes, had never even seen an ocean, and put on a boat and transported for long periods of time in these boats. Chain. Many died on these long journeys, and when I was at the slave lodge, they have this picture that I'll put up where they look like sardines, just covering every inch of the boat. And the reason they did this was because they accounted for a percentage of people that wouldn't make it, so they needed to make sure that they had enough slaves when they got to the other side. The other picture I have is a oil painting or watercolor painting, I can't remember which one it is, of what it would have been like in those hollows that they were kept. I also have a video that I took at the slave lodge where they show the hull of the ship or one of the ships where these people were held. And I'll put that up on the socials. So why remember slavery? It is largely depressing to look back on. But as I stated in my last episode, these are the people that many South Africans of all races and cultural backgrounds are descendants of. Slaves also play an important role in the development of what we see in South African culture today. So history is always told and told by the people who governed or who fought, and these people came here against their will and had to form a society and a community that we still feel in our bones, me especially, very, very deeply. And it's important that we remember them. In the book Colored, which I've mentioned so many times, it must be nauseating to you guys. It says, colored communities in South Africa carry in their cultural DNA marks of being products of imposition, miscegenation, sorry, that word gets me every time, misrecognition, dispossession, and slavery. When Malay people were shipped to Africa and African people were shipped to the Americas, they became part of communities that are products of slavery, which forcefully dislocated them from their homes and birthrights. People who, in a brutal process of being displaced, were dispossessed of their heritage, only to be told that they were unrecognizable in new lands or unrecognized in new lands, needing to form new communities born out of structural violence, rape, and other dehumanizing practices. Their realities were often a mishmash of communities bound by the convenience and inconvenience of others, while attempting to forge new ways of living together and becoming cohesive and functional communities. It's just so beautifully said. But it's a thing of the past, Rihanna. Is it? Is it really? It's naive if we believe that it has ended. My husband, who's a history nut, always says there are patterns in history that should not be ignored, that should be studied and understood so you can recognize them when you see them again. In writing this, there are many times I went, oh, sounds familiar. To be able to recognize it, that only comes through knowledge and understanding. So let's talk through some facts as it pertains to the current day slavery. This is from the website Anti-Slavery. According to the latest global estimates of modern slavery of 2022 from Walk Free, the International Labour Organization and the International Organization of Migration, 49.6 million people live in modern slavery, in forced labor and forced marriage. Roughly a quarter of all victims of modern slavery are children. 22 million people are in forced marriages. 2 out of 5 of these people are children. Of the 27.6 million people trapped in forced labor, 17.3 million are in forced labor exploitation in the private economy, 6.3 million are in the commercial and sexual exploitation, and nearly 4 million are in forced labor imposed by state authorities. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the conditions that lead to modern slavery. Migrant workers are particularly vulnerable to forced labor. Now, I don't know if the internet is following me or I'm following the internet. Because while I was looking at this whole Russian influencer South Africa thing happened. And I was like, wow, that could happen. Recently listened to a podcast where they were talking about people going into, I think they thought they were going to India to be call center agents and earn all this money, and they ended up in, wait, I'm trying to think now. It was a bad country. I can't remember now. But they were literally held hostage to do this work, to earn money to go back home. Their passports were held. They were in the middle of nowhere. So it's not like they could run. As it in actual fact, on this website, it speaks about being able to recognize it. And when you're talking to somebody, how to to tell if there's something suspicious. I remember, because you guys know I'm a true crime girly, I remember girls being taken from their countries, going to work for diplomats, rich people in these other countries and being mistreated. And one was actually killed. And if I remember the episode, I'll link it below. So today I said we're talking about chattel slavery. And I hope that's the last time I have to say those words. But there are the types of slavery. Whenever we have categories, I just go, this shouldn't exist. Human trafficking, forced labor, debt and bonded labor, forced and early marriage, and domestic servitude, which is most of what I spoke to now. Okay, so coming back to South Africa. So slavery into South Africa with a Cape Town slant, and I do recognize that. We are going to cover the period from 1652 to when it was abolished in 1834. When I was at the slave lodge, there was a quote that said, "The history of slavery at the Cape was silenced for decades after emancipation and during apartheid. It was not to be found or written in school curriculums. Generations of those who descended from the enslaved and from slaveholders did not know about this history after it passed from living memory. However, it is important to note that through oral traditions, some Black families descended from the enslaved people has continued to pass on this historical knowledge and the connection to it through their children." When slaves started being brought into the Cape by the VOC, the use of slaves by the VOC in their colonies was already well established as a way to get controlled labor. And that was also true here in the Cape, because the locals were just having none of it. So where did these slaves come from? Last week I spoke about the large slave market in Batavia, and those slaves coming to the Cape, as per the request of Jan, as controlled workforce, enslaved labor from that market, which then covers 1652 and 1658, probably beyond. And in 1658, we had this just weird large consignment of 178 Angolan slaves on the Amersfoort, and then 228 from the Gulf of Guinea, which is today's Benin. Then post that, again from 1658 to 1807 or 1808, slaves from the Indian Ocean dominated. This included, as I stated last week, Madagascar, Mozambique, East Africa, India, Ceylon, and Indonesia. Estimates suggest that 63,000 enslaved people were brought to the Cape before the trade ended. Let's talk about and zone into Southeast Asia. And the reason why I want to do that is because there is this Cape Malay. And when you say Malay, you're going, Malaysia? You didn't mention Malaysia. I'll just speak about where all these guys came from. From Indonesia, you had Java, Sumatra, Sulawesi, Banda, Ambon, Tidore, Ternate, Bali, and then those people were either political exiles, they were artisans, they were soldiers, they were leaders, traders, all of these things, and Muslims, Christians. It was quite the variety that came from Indonesia. Then we had Malacca in Malaysia, which we visited when we were there. So the VOC took over Malacca from the Portuguese in 1641 and then started shipping slaves from there. And these are Malay Muslims and Indian Muslims. Then we have this region where it says Indonesia or Malaysia, which is Borneo and Rio Lingga and Johor. From Rio Lingga and Johor, you had Malay nobility. From Borneo, you had traders. And then you had guys coming from the Philippines, which were sailors. Okay, so that's the mix. So why Malay? Why this blanket term? So the VOC and later the British colonists lumped all Southeast Asian Muslims and many from Southeast Asia, if they weren't even Muslim, under Malay, regardless of their actual ethnicity. This was partly due to the Malay language, which was spoken in both Batavia and Malacca. That's essentially where it comes from. I didn't want to overlook that. Then you go, Rihanna, but what about all those Indian people in Durban? Okay. So the VOC did not distribute slaves to the port of Natal because it didn't control it. Slaves came into the port of Natal, but not as much as came into the Cape. And in actual fact, the Indian population growth happened after or post the end of the VOC in the 19th century. Okay, so now you arrive. You are on this boat for I don't even know how long. You'd have stopped at, what did I say, Mauritius, Madagascar. Once company slaves had arrived in the Cape, they were taken to the slave lodge. In some instances, via the company hospital, which was situated opposite the lodge in Herengracht, which is today's Adley Street. By contrast, slaves destined for private sale at the Cape were auctioned. A tradition suggests that some of these slaves were sold under a tree in Spin Street, Cape Town. There was this man, John Jummet, who used to sell Cook Sisters fruits and sweets from his stall under the slave tree on Church Square, Cape Town. So where he sold his goods was where slaves were auctioned. Private slaves were subsequently transferred and resold like any other form of property. The prices these human commodities fetched depended on scarcity, their age, their health, and their place of origin. Cape-born slaves generally fetched a higher price. The craft skills of slaves from the East were also much sought. So there were groups of slaves. Woohoo! And categorization. Whenever I see categorization, I always think there's a want to separate, there's a want to create a class structure, and there's a want to create animosity between these different groups because they are generally treated differently. Where have we seen this before? Okay, so let's get into it. The Dutch East India Company of VOC was the largest single owner of slaves of the Cape. The company slaves, as they were called, were kept at the slave lodge, which was under prison-like conditions. The men, women, and children were kept under terrible conditions. Witnesses at the time, such as Otto Menzel, said it was so dark within the slave lodge you could not see your hand in front of your face. That must have been terrifying. The lodge was built in 1679, and a total over 9,000 company slaves were kept there until 1811. Lighting changed, much better. It's gotten darker. Change the lighting. This is dramatic. Apologies. You know, the burned blind. We hear. The second grouping of slaves were patrician slaves who belonged to the VOC officials and were kept in private homes. It's important to note that there are no records of these slaves, as the patricians were the record keepers for the company, and they did not note the existence of these slaves. The third group of slaves belonged to the free burghers. The burghers soon realized that they required extra labor, as they had the task of settling on and cultivating lands belonging to the indigenous Khoi groups. Slave labor was required to develop and build the settlement of the Cape and to work the farms of the free burghers. In addition, the VOC drew on the labor and knowledge of the Khoi and the San indigenous groups because it was their land. They knew what was going on. The fourth and the smallest group were free blacks that lived in the Cape. According to the historian Robert Schell, the free blacks were a subgroup of the free burghers. They weren't owned by anybody, and they were all confined to the urban area of Cape Town. They owned the least amount of slaves and were also the poorest of the slave-owning groups. Over time, the free blacks manumitted many enslaved people, and in this way, the group of free blacks grew over time. As early as 1711, the slaves outnumbered the free burghers. The pattern persisted until 1795. By 1795, there were 16,839 slaves in private hands, most of whom lived in the Cape District and surrounding arable farming lands of Stellenbosch and Drakenstein. During the VOC period at the Cape, there were less women than men in all sections of the population. A very substantial gender imbalance existed among privately owned slaves. Only to 30% were women. The slave owners at the Cape preferred to invest their money in male slaves. Over time, a considerable portion of the population of the Cape became mixed as relationship formed between slave men and Khoi and San women, and between slave women and male colonists. Liaisons between slave women in the slave lodge and VOC employees were also common. Before I get into the next part, I just want to raise a trigger warning. It speaks about rape and sexual assault, and I just wanted to make that clear. So if you are triggered, please go forward until we speak about slave names. The enslaved suffered severe physical, sexual, and psychological abuse as chattel slaves all across the Cape, in the slave lodge, and wherever they were distributed to. The 15-hour day cycle started early morning at 7 a.m. when the mandors, which is the foreman, led the enslaved workers to various posts across the Cape, and they would return each evening at 7. And from 8 to 9, free men would enter the slave lodge and use the enslaved for sex. The slave lodge has been referred to as a brothel. That is not correct. It suggests both moral deviancy and choice by the enslaved people and enslaved women in the slave lodge. We know that all slaves in the Cape, including all company slaves, were chattel slaves, so they were owned objects. They had no legal control over their body in terms of time, space, and labor, which includes the way they were used for sex. By using the word brothel, you are saying that there was consent, and that just isn't true. It's important to note that no man was ever convicted of rape of an enslaved woman, man, or child during the slavery period. And in many cases, slave holders and company officials also encouraged their female slaves to have sex with men in order for them to increase their fortune in the hopes of their slaves falling pregnant. The children born to enslaved women automatically became the property of the slave holder, and this increased slaveholders' profits and slave holdings. There are even tales about how women went and reported some of their slaveholders who said that they would be freed, they would be manumitted if they just entered into a sexual relationship with them, and then they wouldn't. They were severely beaten when they said no. By the 1770s, the majority of slaves were locally born. By 1834, 3/4 of the slaves were either born locally to an enslaved mother and father, or was born of unions between free men and enslaved women. It's always hard for me to talk about, and I'm sure for you to hear that, but it is a truth. It is a truth that you cannot overlook. When slaves arrived in the Cape, the first thing that was taken away from them was their name. They were stripped of the very thing that made them who they were, because they were property. Enslavers commonly renamed people to strip them of their identity and mark ownership. At the Cape, several patterns recurred. Calendar names, January, February, September, October, April, etc., still visible today as surnames. Month names were the most popular names, especially for enslaved people from the Indian subcontinent. There are two takes on how it happened. Some say the month was based on the month that you were brought into the Cape. The other says that it was the month that you were put on the auction block. Then we had classical or Old Testament like Cupido, Titus, Hannibal, Moses, Solomon. To name a slave after a god and emperor was a common household device. The joke would be revealed when the slave came upon livestock or pet that had his or her own name. Descriptive or belittling names: Dikbeen, thick leg; Dikkop, thick head; or Welkom, welcome. welcome. Toponyms, which we spoke about last week, which is Van Bengal, Van Madagascar, Van de Kaap, of those who were born in the Cape, Van de Kust. Those are the names came about. Now, let's talk about how they controlled these slaves. Because if there were more slaves than free burghers or colonists, we're going to see some things that you're going to recognize. Enslaved people at the Cape were considered property with no legal authority. They could be bought, sold, or transferred at will by their owner. Then there were the punishments for disobedience. There were whippings, which were administered to instill fear. Branding. Some slaves were branded with the owner's mark. Amputation and mutilation, which were in cases of resistance or escape. Being forced to work in chains, and public executions to stir fear in the other slaves. You could either get your whippings in public or you could get them in the trunk, in the jail. Sometimes you were given the choice, sometimes you were not. Between 1680 and 1795, one slave was publicly executed per day. One such gruesome case of public torture and execution was performed on, this person's got a very fabulous name. I hope I don't mess it up. Franciscus Xaverius van Tranquebar. He was crucified upside down and then dragged backwards and forwards through the streets of Cape Town. His body was eventually hung at Gallows Hill on the outskirts of town, present-day Greenpoint. Then we had Lena van der Gaap. Lena deserted in 1725. She joined a fugitive slave society, that's very interesting, at Hung Clip near present-day Betty's Bay. Lena and the Maroons managed to survive by stealing from surrounding farms when ammunition and food was required. When she was caught in 1730, she was flogged and branded, and she had to work in heavy chains until the day she passed. Families were routinely split apart, husbands from wives and children sold to different owners. Control through alcohol. We all know about the dope system. When we were in Australia at Ayers Rock and the community doesn't allow outsiders in, there's strict control of the alcohol in where we were allowed to stay because it's been used as a tool of domination. I will do a comparison. I'll do a short video on the socials about this. Slave owners or tavern keepers often provided cheap or free alcohol to enslaved workers. Alcohol dependency was encouraged to weaken resistance and increase compliance, to reduce the likelihood of planning an escape or rebellion, to foster economic dependence, because sometimes alcohol was used as a payment or reward instead of wages, the dope system. Then there were pass laws. There was Licenty brief, a letter to control movement. As early as the 17th century, slaves had to carry this briefy letter when out after curfew. These letters were written and signed by the slave holder. If the slave was found after curfew without this, they were accused of being runaways and they would be jailed. Historian Robert Schall argued that this letter was the first version of the pass system, which emerged in full during apartheid. History repeating itself. Even free people of color face restrictions on property ownership, access to markets, and public spaces. We spoke about forced labor. Slaves were compelled to work in vineyards, wheat fields, and livestock farms, urban construction, and domestic service. Workdays were long, often from dawn to dusk. Physical exhaustion, malnutrition, and disease were common consequences of this labor. Use of the native language and cultural practices was discouraged or punished. Religious and cultural education was controlled. Slaves were often forced to conform or adopt the Dutch reform practices while maintaining their tradition in secret. There were many iterations of the way that slaves were controlled. One, which was introduced by Rake Tilbach, who was the governor of the Cape from 1751 to 1771. He did maybe two or three things different. I just want to point those out because they became more restrictive and tightened control. The one was clothing restrictions, they were forbidden from wearing shoes and hats except on Sundays, or when they were sent on errands for their masters. The clothing had to be distinct from freeburgers, so you could visibly see somebody that's enslaved by what they were wearing. Apart from the movement restrictions when it comes to curfews and having a pass wherever you went, you also had to ask permission to gather in a group, and you couldn't attend dances, feasts, or public events unless specifically authorized. Then there was the runaway reward system. If you captured a runaway, they would reward you. It was really encouraged to tell on each other. Where have I heard this before? I just want to note that because it's not like one law was put in place and that's the way that the slaves were dealt with until, it was banished. It did get tighter and was more restrictive over time. Then we look at the cultural and linguistic influences of these people, these enslaved people. So the home languages of the slaves that came to South Africa were diverse, and by the 18th century, a local Dutch-based Creole language had developed at the Cape as a result of the interaction of people who spoke a variety of languages but who had to communicate in Dutch. This became known as Afrikaans, and it eventually became dominant in homes and streets of the Cape and widely adopted in South Africa. So funny that they call it a Creole language. Afrikaans also absorbed Malay and Indonesian. They call it loan words. So baya is Malay banyak. Pisang is the same in Malay. Baichi, baju in Malay. Belacang is belacan in Malay. And Kombuis is Portuguese via Malay. When I went to Malaysia and even when I was in Indonesia, I realized that some of the words we were using that we thought were Arabic were actually Malay. So slamat is Malay. Jamang is Malay. So all these words that you just recognize. And when people talking, you're like, oh, wow, we use the same word. Origin stories. Then from a religion was a lot of people coming here who were Muslim. And it kind of became the alternative that the enslaved chose to Christianity, which many saw as the religion of the oppressor. So there was Afrikaans and Arabic manuscripts became common. Cuisine, there's so many, but I'm just going to mention some. Baboati, Sasati, Bridi, Cook Sister, spicy food, Blachang, the heavy use of cinnamon, cloves, and nutmegs, spice wars. If you don't know, find out. Then we have music and festivities. We have the Cape Malay choirs, the Kaapse klopse, which we all know, and the Guma drum rhythms traced to Indonesian percussion traditions. Isn't it so fascinating that a people that was so oppressed managed to carry those things through to who we are today? And it's just ingrained in our person. They could have been so oppressed that could have been lost with time. We went to Malaysia, to Malacca. It was a Friday after mosque. We found this random place. My husband was really hungry. We had just ridden from Kuala Lumpur. We found this place. Plastic chairs. Massive place to sit. We had the curry. It was assembled differently. And we start eating it. And he goes, this is your curry. How? How does it still taste the same? So many generations later. And I just found that beautiful and just really a hat off to people that kept those traditions and kept that spice and kept those things alive, as we always do. What lessons are learned here? And that is one of our first lessons. Enslaved people from Africa, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, beyond kept elements of their language, their culture, their cuisine, their music alive. Their religion by blending it into the uniquely South African culture. These people came together. They were so different. They spoke different languages and they created this Creole language and built a new kinship in the harshest of situations, and they built this multicultural community. Not every resistance was an open revolt, and most of these little steps were ways of protection or a way of escaping their daily lives by keeping those traditions alive. The economy, language, and cuisine and cultural fabric of South Africa was built by enslaved people, by their labor, their creativity, and they want to keep their culture alive. History will say that slavery was abolished by the British in 1807 across the British Empire. So that effectively ended the legal importation of slaves into the Cape in 1808. Slavery still continued. You had prize slaves being brought from East Africa to the Cape. They were captured by the British Navy by foreign slave ships and were not liberated, but apprenticed to the Cape colonist for a number of years, initially in conditions, but not very different from slavery. Then the 1st of December in 1834, Emancipation Proclamation happened. People were reclassified as apprentices tied to former owners for 4 years, which is indentured slavery, indentured labor. So they were tied to their former owners for 4 years more of compulsory labor. True legal freedom in the Cape effectively came in 1838. When a system has been so deeply built and deeply ingrained, when you say the law has been changed, these people still say was still faced with poverty, discrimination, and lack of land. Structural inequality requires long-term correction. And we come the end of this episode. It's been a hard one. It's been hard to research, but it's so ending with that, how those things that they brought from those faraway lands still exist in my bones, in my person, in my family, in the people around me, in the place that I live, is uplifting, if nothing else. So thank you so much for sticking with me with this one. It was a bit of a longer one, but I didn't want to miss anything out, and thank you for sticking it out. Next week, we'll learn more about the people that were part of that time. And then the week after that, we'll get into the people that dissented. And that's always good. The people that just went, whatever you do, I'm not going to be part of this. We love a good rebel. So stick around for the next 2 episodes. Let's keep learning together. And hope Rihanna doesn't go down a rabbit hole in the next couple of days. But thank you so much for listening. Subscribe and like wherever you're watching the podcast. And see you guys next week.